Hello everyone, welcome to a Fire Emblem 9 Path of Radiance Maniac Mode character guide. After I posted a previous video about Maniac Mode and defending it a little bit and analyzing it a bit, I floated the idea of making a tier list, and someone in the comments said, hey, why not make a character guide and compare it to your old lists from hard mode? I was like, that's a pretty good idea. I like the idea of doing a character guide especially because it is more about advice and talking about what are good ideas, rather than trying to evaluate exactly how good every unit is. Instead, it's more about putting them in broad categories and talking about what are good ideas to do in a playthrough. So, in a way, you can think of it as a way to give recommendations to someone before they play, rather than evaluating how good everyone was after a playthrough. That's one way of looking at it. I'm using the tier list maker because it's aesthetically very useful, but it's not actually a tier list. Maniac mode is a lot more restrictive than hard. That's reflected in the categories I'm using. For the old lists on hard mode, I had one category for high effort where I put Rolf and no one else because I thought everyone else was quite salvageable. And in this one, I'm going to be a bit more strict on the characters because I do want to make it clear that Maniac mode resources are just a lot more scarce, specifically bonus experience and money. Bonus experience, you get about half of what you would get on hard mode, just divided by 2. And money, forges are more expensive on the Japanese version of the game than the English version, and Maniac mode is a Japanese exclusive difficulty, so generally speaking, you're not going to have as much money for forging and other resources than you would have. And that has an effect on what units are viable and which are less viable. You can still get away with using anyone, especially if you've played the mode before, but it's going to be a lot rougher, and in your first playthrough, I would recommend mostly sticking to the upper echelons of this character guide. If you haven't watched my previous video on Maniac, you should check it out. It's not required watching for this. I'm going to recap the most important parts, but I think if you're interested in this video, you will also be interested in that one. Before we get into it, one last rule, I guess. Crit forging is an important mechanic that I will mention quite a bit, so might as well get it out of the way here. The Japanese version has a glitch that allows you to make forges that crit 100% of the time. I use these in the playthrough that I'm mostly basing this advice on, not just that playthrough, but also just talking with other people like Rad, Rancor, and Mr. Legis, so thank you for your contributions. But they generally played without crit forges, and I played with them. I found them quite fun to use, but I feel like they are cheating in a way. They are exploiting a glitch, an unintentional thing by the developers. But they made the game less tedious and more fun for me, so I'm going to include them. I will mention it that like if you aren't using crit forges, then that might change the evaluations of some characters. That's going to change some characters, make them worse because they don't have access to them, or make them better, relatively speaking. So keep that in mind as we're going through. And yeah, other than that, let's have fun. Let's jump into it. Units will not be ordered within the category. They'll just be in order of recruitment, just like the queue at the bottom here. So we'll start with Ike. I'm going to throw Ike in good investment, and this is right away a bit of a weird entry because Ike isn't good for most of the game. In fact, he might be a liability depending on how his stats turn out. The one I got in my Iron Man playthrough was quite blessed and quite good. Specifically, his speed got very blessed and also his strength. His bulk was a bit screwed, but most of the time he did more damage than he would do for you. So keep that in mind if you're using your Ike and he doesn't turn out as well as mine in the footage. The thing with Ike is for the first 26 chapters, he is a one-range locked unit with good supports, but locks to swords for the most part, besides the Sonic Sword, which doesn't really count. So that alone limits how much he can do against a massive amount of enemies that have 1-2 range, especially after chapter 18, or after chapter 17, when the enemy difficulty ramps up a lot. Almost every enemy is going to have 1-2 range, or like a bow if they're like a warrior or a paladin. So it's going to be tough for Ike to do a lot of enemy phase. But at the same time, I think you're going to have more of more struggles on Maniac if you don't train Ike than if you do. So it's worth putting up with him, even if he's a bit of a liability sometimes. For one, because he gives really good supports. He supports Oscar, he supports Soren, and he supports Titania if you are using only one of those 2 characters, or even none of them. And that alone is very helpful. If you have like a base level Ike supporting those, then the support is not going to be very helpful to you, especially once you get into territory where a lot of enemies have 3-10 range. If they're like trying to bolting your Oscar, keeping Ike away from him, but in support range is quite a pain. So you would much rather have a level 20 Ike at that point, or whatever high level you can get him to. It's not super tough to train him, but it is a bit annoying, and also so is his late promotion. And then in the very late game, chapter 27, you will have access to the Ragnell. There's a couple of bosses that only Ike can fight, and you will want him to be as strong as possible, and he'll be probably your best unit, if not like your top 3 best unit. And I usually don't recommend training your lords for that little portion of the game where they're good alone, but I think with Ike, the investment isn't that hard to do, and the payoff in those few things is going to make it much less of a headache. It's just nice to have a guy with the wreck now. You can just send it to enemy territory and just kill everything. And with the Earth support, she should pretty much never die at that point. So that's very, very good to have, but it's only for that last bit of the game. For the most part, he'll be fine. Like after he promotes, he's like, okay, giving him Ether is recommended. You don't have many better uses for the Mastery Scrolls, the Occult Scrolls, than Ike getting Ether. Like, you have Soul, and then there's like, the next best option is like Boyd Colossus or Luna on a General maybe, and that's like already quite far from how good Ether is. So I would recommend just putting Ether on him, even if you plan on giving him Wrath or Resolve later. Having Ether on him is just quite nice after Chapter 18. So I would just do that. Next up is Titania, going to be the first no-brainer. I guess I didn't really go over the categories, even though I've explained them a couple times before, but no-brainers are units that I think you should always use unless there's a very good reason not to in like a specific chapter. And I'm not going to like regard availability here at all. I'm going to put units here that even aren't available for the entire game, but when you have them, you should deploy them, is basically what this means. And that kind of goes for good investment too, but investment units are units that like require experience, bonus experience, forges, etc. Whereas units that are no investments require very little or none of that, basically. Ike requires investments. Titania, I mean, she would like some resources, but she's generally really good even without investments. And you should deploy her always. For like the first portion of the game, you don't even have a choice, and you'll want to use Titania on pretty much every enemy that you fight. She makes the game so much less tedious. If you have any reservations about using your Jagan, your Oifi, your Seth, your pre-promotes, you should try to get rid of that for playing Maniac Mode, because playing it with less Titania or no Titania is going to be a huge, huge headache for you. And in a way, she saves you experience thanks to the bonus experience mechanic, where if you clear chapters faster, you get more bonus experience for them. And so you can use that bonus experience to raise the training projects you have. What I'd like to do with Titania, on honestly all of FE9, but especially the first few chapters on Maniac, is send her away from my other units if I can. Make her fight enemies by herself with a vulnerary and like a full inventory of weapons. And then have Ike and Boyd and Soren and Oscar figuring out kills somewhere else where they're not hindering Titania's enemy face offense. A good example of this is Chapter 2. There's a chapter where you have Ike, Chadtrie, Shinon, Soren, Rhys, and Titania, and that's it. If you have Ike, if you have Titania, pull the first couple of enemies and then finish them off with Chadtrie and Ike, for example, you're gonna have so many enemies in your camp threatening Soren and Rhys and Ike, and it's just not going to be a good time. Whereas if you send Titania off on her own, far away from your group, then Titania can fight almost everything by herself, and Ike and friends can get some kills, but not a whole lot. And this is good because they can't get more kills than they are safe to fight anyway, if you get what I mean. If there's 10 enemies around them, they're not going to be helped by the more experience available. They're more worried about running for their lives, basically. And there's not a whole lot of places you can run in that chapter in the first place. So move Titania away from your units and have her fight by herself in that chapter, and in the chapter where Mia joins, and honestly a lot of chapters where it's just not safe for units to pick up kills and going slower. There are chapters where you can feed units a bit more liberally, but in chapters where it's very, very cramped and you just have so many enemies staring you down, just have Titania kill almost everything. Now, that's what Titania can mostly do for free. To keep her going later on, you're going to need to invest into her a little bit, but not to the point where it really hurts other units. The first thing that makes her a lot better is the existence of the Night Ward, which you get from Astrid in chapter 13, I want to say. I mean, it's a boat chapter, you know which one I mean. First of all, it just gives you +2 defense and res on Titania, which is welcome, because even at that point in the game, she's still likely going to be your best unit, and having your best unit take 2 less damage every combat is a good thing, if not a great thing. And then on top of that, it gives her 30% extra speed growth. If you're not going to have the Night Ward on her at all times, at least have it on her when she is about to level up, which is very easy because she's so over-leveled that she gains experience slowly. And so giving her the Night Ward on a turn where she's about to level up is very easy. Make sure that before she gets the XP to level up, she has it equipped. If you just have Titania move somewhere and wait or attack or something, and then trade the Night Ward to her, then she's not going to have it equipped. You need her to actually use her turn to equip it. And then she should have 30% extra speed growth. If you're in the base, you can also make use of this. This is great because it keeps your speed competitive, and you're going to need all the speed procs you can get to double the late game. My favorite example of enemies that are tough to kill are paladins. They have 20 or more speed for the later part of the game, and Titania is not always going to reach that without the help of the Night Ward. You should do this for other characters too, but for Titania it's the easiest thing to do because she has the highest level of everyone. Next up is Oscar. Oscar is also a good investment. I was contemplating putting him in No-Brainer, but I don't think he's quite that good, but he is pretty good. Early game, he is trash. His combat is not good. He barely doubles. The things he doubles are the things everyone doubles, and he does like no damage. But you kind of want to put up with it because the end result is just so nice. He is the horse to rescue drop people. That's not super relevant early on, but it like has its uses later. Really the main reason I think Oscar's so good is Earth Affinity. Being able to support Ike and maybe Tanith later on, or Kieran, is just really, really safe for him. The great thing about avoiding attacks is that it works against both enemies that use physical and magical attacks. So unlike, say, Chadtrie, who's got good defense but bad resistance, or I guess Rhys, who has the other way around, Oscar is comfortable living both types of attacks, and he does have enough attack power, usually I think, to kill enemy sages if he needs to. So, unlike, say, Rhys, for example. So that makes him a really good guy to just stick out there and be like, you can't kill this, and I'll just slowly kill the enemies. It doesn't hurt that much that he doesn't 1-round KO anything, or sometimes he even fails to 2-round KO anything. He just survives, keeps enemies at bay, maybe chokes a point, maybe just attracts their attention so that they don't move closer to units you're trying to keep safe, like Mist or Reyson or even Ike. He just keeps you safe for a lot of the game. Oscar is the first unit I would say that is massively influenced by the existence of crit forges. It is not really that relevant for Titania because she's going to be the best no matter what. Like, she can use a forged slim lance to kill things faster, but if she doesn't have crit forges, she still does the most damage out of anyone for most of the game. Ike doesn't really care about slim sword forges because they're the most expensive. They cost about 19k, whereas the Thunder and slim lance forges, they cost more like 14k from the top of my head. But Oscar makes use of the slim lances quite well because he lacks the attack power to kill things unless he has that. Then he's quite good. I gave him Adept in my playthrough, which was quite nice. He was able to get 1-on kills more frequently with that. But he can use a lot of different skills, I think, to great effect. You can give him Soul through an Occult Scroll, which will make him even more durable. There's probably chances for him to die if he doesn't have full Earth investment, or maybe even if he does, depending on the enemy hit rates. Maybe Biorhythm can screw him up, maybe Weapon Triangle can screw him up. So having Soul as an extra safety net can be nice. In addition, there's also the option of giving him Provoke. I haven't tried this, but I feel like in theory it works as long as you have a durable enough Oscar. Like I said before, he's good against both physical and magical enemies once his Avoid gets going. Being able to provoke all those long-range tomes away from more vulnerable units while also being able to direct physical attacks towards himself is going to be quite nice. I put Provoke on Chadtrie in my playthrough. I think the best candidate is probably Soren, but Oscar is someone who could potentially work both ways. So I think Provoke would be quite nice. The way Provoke kind of works, to give a brief summary, is that it changes AI priority higher towards the unit with Provoke. And that sounds very unreliable, and it is, but in my playthrough I found that most of the time I was able to predict whether enemies were going for a Provoke unit or not. And the most important determining factors is if an enemy can kill or nearly kill your units, then they will ignore Provoke, or if they see that the person without Provoke cannot counter what a person with Provoke can. So like if Chadtrie had a Javelin with Provoke, and he also had the enemy also not option to attack like Boyd without a hand axe, like with an iron axe, then they would go for Boyd because he didn't counter. So as long as you make sure that your Provoke unit cannot counterattack, or that everyone else can also counterattack, and you make sure that no one else is like about to die to the enemy attack, then Provoke is pretty good. And in that sense, you can bait enemies away for like obvious KOs. Like if say Boyd and Oscar are both in range and Boyd is getting like 3-shot while Oscar is getting 6-shot with higher avoid, the enemies will still go for Oscar as long as they both counter and neither are about to die. You know what I mean? That's how Provoke can be very useful. And Oscar is one of the people with the most durability able to make use of that. And other than that, I mean, he's a paladin, he has a horse, he can use the Night Ward to get more speed level ups, and eventually his offense is probably passable enough. It kind of sucks that he barely does any damage to like enemy generals, but what can you do? He's just so tanky that he's good to use. Next is Boyd, who I think is also a good investment. My Boyd got quite screwed on speed. I think even factoring in speed wings, I think I was -4 on like speed averages before he died, and his strength also wasn't that good. But normally, on hard at least, Boyd gets enough speed to double and then enough attack power to twist KO. On Maniac, I don't think he's gonna one round quite as much, but he's still the unit that comes closest with like 1 or 2 possible exceptions. And, you know, if the enemy dies, they're not around to threaten your more vulnerable units, so you'll probably want to have a unit like this on your playthrough. Now, he is, after Ike, the only unit we've discussed so far that doesn't have a mount, and I'll take this time to explain, perhaps for the second time, that not having a mount is not a death sentence for being good in Path of Radiance. Once you have a fair amount of mounted units, like if you have like 6 on your team already, adding a 7th is not going to add that much, and you're probably better looking for another niche to fulfill than a unit that can rescue drop or have high movement. You're better off with a unit that can, for example, put up acceptable offense, which is something that both Oscar and Titania struggle with in the late game. And Oscar even struggles with in the early game. Having a 6-move unit that can kill enemies becomes more valuable at that point than having another unit that can not one round, but move further at least. And there's quite a bit of room in Path of Radiance for units like this, like Soren and Boyd and perhaps Ilyana, and there's probably going to be more examples of this later. So I don't think not being mounted is a big deal as long as you have enough mounted units to make it work. And in addition, on Maniac Mode, you're often not moving as far as you normally are because it's just too dangerous for a lot of your units. So you're often moving in as like a massive ball death, and you can only ball death if your units do like roughly the same amount of movement anyway. So you might have to slow down your mounted units regardless. That's not to say that the high move isn't useful. Being able to go back and forth between the front lines and the back lines is really nice. And high move has a ton of applications still, but low move is not a death sentence, and it's definitely not for Boyd. That said, if his speed doesn't turn out well, or if his strength turns out like not good enough, then there's still a chance that the RNGs is not kind enough to Boyd. You might have to drop him, and there's not really any unit like him that can replace him. I don't think Largo, for example, can really make up for a strength screw Boyd, but if he turns out well in his first couple of level ups, then just keep him going, and he's going to be quite nice for you. But he is a unit that at some point has to like start putting out damage before he's really in it for the long term. Rhys is going to be our first special utility. For some reason, I never put him in special utility in the previous lists, and I had like thieves there and like late game units for some reason. But honestly, healing is enough special utility for me to put him there, and also put Mist there. We might as well just talk about them in tandem. So I think the healers are quite nice to have, and you should probably pick one for Maniac. I don't think they're obligatory for Path of Radiance, but the fact that you only have like vulneraries for self-healing and then elixirs is like a quite rare item is so big that it's just really good to have a healer like this. Path of Radiance is pretty generous with physic as long as you have Volk around to steal them. So you're probably going to see Volk in special utility as well. My Volk died before he could steal a lot of physic, but I still had like 3 of them total, and that was enough to last me the entire game. And that's physic alone is enough to be like a super massive help, but obviously the normal stabs help too, like just healing and mending to give people extra turns and not have to spend money on vulneraries is nice. And on top of that, there's a couple portions later on where you're facing like status stabs, so Restore comes in handy. Hammering is good to repair forges or other costly weapons. Maybe crit forges, if you're using those, can be repaired. So in that sense, they save you a lot of money as well if you can get the hammer and staff, which I think you get from a base convo, so it's pretty much a given if you get that. Just keep Soren alive, I guess. So yeah, having a healer is good, and I think it's special enough. You can get like Soren or Ilyana to heal as well, of course, but they'll start at a lower staff rank than Mist and especially Rhys if you use them. The chapters are quite slow, so there's a lot of time to get them heal experience, even if you're not necessarily healing vital wounds like this, like HP level ups or like an enemy do like 3 damage to you, you can heal that for a bit of HP. You'll play Fireman for a while. If you're playing Maniac Mode, you're playing Fireman for a while, you know how to level up healers. So quite good. Don't be shy about using a Master Seal to promote them to tier 2. It might be tempting to try and go for like a max level Mist or Rhys, but it's going to take so long, and especially for Mist, the promotion to getting a horse is such a bigger deal than anything else. My Mist has terrible stats and was able to take like 1 hit from enemies for most of the game, but that's enough to keep her safe for the most part. Her res is good enough to survive long range magic, and she's just fine that way. There was one other thing about Mist. She's in the Black Knight fight, of course. This was the first time I was able to keep her alive all the way for that, and it was really vital to having a better chance at doing it. I didn't manage to do it, but it was quite vital. So if you're someone who cares about the Black Knight fight, then you maybe want to get Nasir, or you just want to see the scene, or you just like the closure that like gets out of it, then it's probably a good idea to have Mist be part of your permanent team. And also you should just pick one of these two for permanent use, I think, for Maniac Mode. There's no reason not to. Next, we have Soren, and I'm going to throw him a no-brainer with the immediate disclaimer that this is based on Crit Forges. If he's not on Crit Forges, he's more like good investment, but he's still a reasonable person to pick and try and use. But let me talk about Crit Forge for Soren first. So, Crit Forge Thunder is the best Crit Forge for OHKOing enemies. Like Slimlance and Slimsword are not going to cut it, but Soren with the Crit Forge can do it. So that alone is great, just being able to nuke enemies on player phase. You're going to have to keep him safe on enemy phase, but when he has that, it's great. On top of that, you can find a Vantage Scroll in, I think, the Makalov chapter, the chapter where you're in the fog with all the pirates. The first one, I think, where you fight feral ones, that one. Vantage, you gotta make sure you get it, because it turns Soren into the best character in the game, the best fighter in the game, the best combat unit in the game. You can put him in like a range of 15 enemies and he'll kill them all with no sweat at all. Because Vantage works 100% of the time. If you have full HP, you always attack first. And if you're 3-shotting the enemy and you have a Crit Forge, you kill them. That's it. You're done. It's over. He just turns the game into Awakening. But with a good unit like Fake or Robin. You know what I mean? So that's quite good. Of course, Soren doesn't start out this way. He started out as a fragile mage that can barely kill anything and has like a single-digit chance to proc at depths and do like a little more damage than he would with his stupid Wind Tome. That sucks, but almost everyone besides Titania is like that, so it's not super difficult to feed him a kill every now and then. I personally, on my Iron Man play, trained Ike, Oscar, Boyd, and Soren with not a whole lot of trouble, and Chadtrie as well. I tried to get him experience too. So if I can train Soren in these circumstances, then you can train Soren in like any circumstance you want. And he should be fine. He gets a lot of magic and speed and leveling up as long as you take your time with it. And as soon as you find advantage, he's going to pop off and just murderize everything. If you don't play with Crit Forges, then he is more of a killing machine that has to be protected a little bit more. So what you would do in that case is keep him as close to Ike as possible for that support, and make enemies go for him as much as is safe, but no more than that. He has good avoid because the Ike support still gives him Earth Affinity, and he has Dark, so he would be quite dodgy, but it won't be as safe as it is with Vantage. You can get healing utility in, just healing people up. Eventually getting the rank for Physic is quite trivial, and even without Vantage Crit Forges, he can still be one of the few people who can one-out enemies, which is quite a feat. He has a depth to go with. I also think it's a really good idea to give Soren Provoke, regardless of Crit Forges or not. If you do play with Crit Forges, then he attracts enemy attention like no one else, because his HP and defenses are quite bad, and enemies love doing a lot of damage. So you might want to do like Sonic Sword Ike to give 1-2 range enemies incentive to attack him over Ike, as in attack Soren over Ike. The Sonic Sword won't break probably, because they'll have the option to attack Soren if you place him right. And that way you just give the enemies the impression that Soren is the better target, just thanks to Provoke. If you don't have Crit Forges, then it's still a good idea to give him Provoke, because he's a great lightning rod for bolting Meteor Blizzard. Soren's res is quite good, especially if you Pure Water or ward him. And once you've done that, then you will keep your frontliners safe. I gave Provoke to Chadtrie in my playthrough because I thought distracting physical enemies was like quite nice, but thinking about it more, I think it makes more sense to distract the long range enemies, because it's harder to keep units out of range of those. And if you have like Chadtrie in the front lines, or Titania or Oscar or Ike, or anyone who has like more defense than res, I set Oscar safe against like res enemies, but he still has like reasonable defense as well. It's just a lot more safer if these frontline units don't have to worry about getting long range magic as well. So keeping Soren close to them, but not in like range of physical enemies, in the event of no Crit Forges, will just basically trivialize the map when it comes to long range tomes. And long range tomes are so common on Maniac that I think it's worth doing that. But thinking about where to put Provoke is, of course, an exercise in itself. So yeah, you can do Vantage, Provoke, Adept in any combination you want, really. Speaking of Provoke, next up is Chadtrie, who was my choice for putting Provoke on during Maniac. Chadtrie was pretty bad in hard mode Path of Radiance because his durability was overkill, and the things that he is bad at matter more, like his speed and mobility. If someone like Oscar or Titania or Kieran has enough bulk to last long enough on the front lines to deal damage and survive, then why would you ever need Chadtrie? But on Maniac, those issues are reversed, and you're kind of looking for having high durability. I found sometimes where you're dealing with really large enemy swarms, especially enemy paladins, durability was pretty binary. I want to say it's either you have enough survivability to just take almost no damage, or you don't have the ability to survive on the front lines at all. And depending on the point of the game and what support you have on Oscar, for example, or whether Ikas or Ragnell, that isn't necessarily true for only Chadtrie, but there were points where I felt like Chadtrie was the safest person by far to put on the front lines, and that's the reason I felt comfortable putting Provoke on him. His HP and defense is just so much higher than everyone else, and Provoke let him keep other units safe from the enemies on the front lines as well. Something I would sometimes do and often get away with is someone like Boyd, who gets maybe like 4 or 5 or 3 hit KO'd by enemies. If there's like 10 enemies nearby, that's not enough for him to survive in an Iron Man, so I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. But with Chadtrie and Provoke nearby, the enemies would almost always go for him over Boyd, as long as I made sure that they both or neither had 1-2 range equipped. And that way, Boyd was kept safe, and Chadtrie could do his thing and just weaken everything. And in addition, I gave Chadtrie their boots. It was kind of more of a meme thing. Like, I think their boots would have been better on a Flyer or even a Paladin, but I felt like it made some sense at least to have Chadtrie keep up with the rest, and it's made it easier to shift Chadtrie from different points of the map. You can imagine that if I needed him at one point and I need him in another, going back and forth takes a really big tax on someone who only has, I believe it's 4 or 5 move, whereas other people would have 5 to 6 or even 7, 8, 9. So boots on Chadtrie worked that way, but I also feel that in Maniac, movement is not as big of a concern because you're not trying to go through a map as fast as possible, but often as safely as possible. Someone like Jill or Marcia will rarely be able to move all the way forward into a map and survive to tell the tale. There's not many maps that you can just fly them over and just win. There are a couple where you could probably do so if you plan out your strategy well, but I didn't. And so for me, boots Chadtrie made some more sense. So I did like a casual playthrough kind of thing, if you will. So that together made Chadtrie pretty good for me, but I think that between the numerous crit forges I gave him and Provoke and the boots and having to give him the Night Ward every level up because his speed is so bad without it, and even with it he didn't double too much, I think I gave him a lot of favoritism, and so I'm still going to place him in just okay investment. I thought he was a good investment target for me overall, but I feel like the lack of offense especially did kind of bite me, and I think I could have thought of better ways to use Provoke on someone like Soren. Or even Oscar, for example. I think they would have done better. But it was really fun to use Chadtrie to his full potential in this playthrough, and I thought he was really good. And if you wanted to, I could see him being up here. Crit Forges are pretty much exclusively a help to him as well, because, I mean, he can use Lances, he uses them pretty well. He doesn't one-shot enemy Paladins with like a Slim Lance Forge, even if max might. So you're still going to have to take multiple turns to kill him, whereas someone like Oscar can get to a point where he doubles them, and then he will actually kill them in one round, I do believe, as long as you have enough strength like your Oscar. Which I know is not a given, but mine managed with an energy drop, so I'm sure you can too. Chadtrie was a lot of fun. Provoke did have a downside in that he also became like a lightning rod for long range magic. The Night Ward kind of helps with that with +2 res, and on top of that you can use like Barrier or Ward to keep him away. But like I said, I think it makes more sense to put it on a high res unit, because long range magic is just harder to manage without Provoke than it is for managing physical enemies. But it was nice to be able to just send Chadtrie to a group of physical enemies and know he's going to come out alive. There were numerous points at this point where I relied almost entirely on Chadtrie, and it worked out well. I don't think he's the only person who can do that kind of stuff, but he's one of the best at it for sure. Next up is Shinon. He is here exclusively for his early game performance. Like, I do not recommend Chadtrie late game at all. If you're just looking at, or Shinon. Late game Shinon is a sanity test, but because he's available in the early game for like 2 or 3 chapters, and after that he vanishes, you can technically say he's okay with no investments. No investments. There you go. Good, no investments. You could also put Chadtrie there, I guess, if you only count his early game, but Chadtrie has more long-term potential, so he's going to get to sit in an okay investment target. But Chadtrie that's dropped after chapter 8 is also a good no investment. But yeah, early game he sets up some kills. He might crit to prevent you from taking the kill with like Ike, but most of the time he's just a good Jagan. Provoke adds in some ways to bait. It's funny that both of these end up with Provoke, actually. I didn't realize that. But yeah, Provoke is nice in the early game for Shinon if you want to bait enemies into attacking him. Sometimes you don't, but usually if you're exposing Shinon, you're okay with him getting attacked, and so Provoke just helps you. And this is a good guy to get set up kills with, or like clean some archers with or something. It's kind of nice, but after chapter, what is it, like chapter 18 when you get him back, that's just when the game gets too hard to kind of deal with his shit. On hard mode, I enjoyed using him a lot, turning him up as a sniper, actually making use of like the funky bows this game has, like the longbow and the double bow, the 4-range bow. That stuff is fun, but it has no real place in a Maniac Mode playthrough where you only use the best units, so just stick to the early game. Kind of brief on that, really. Ilyana, I'm gonna put her next to Soren, I believe. Just double checking my old list. For the crit forge thing, with the same caveat that if you don't use crit forges, then Ilyana goes way the fuck down. Like I said, Soren would still be a good investment, I think, because like I said, his offense still stands out enough, and his durability with the Ike support is just good enough to where you can get away with putting him on the front lines every now and then. Ilyana is a bit more fragile for that. She doesn't have an earth support available. She has, like, I think Mist and Mordecai as a support partners, which gave her some defense, but not enough to reliably reach like more thresholds than Soren does, I believe. No innate adept, so you'd have to give that to her separately, and adept is a pretty good scroll that you want to give to almost all the good units here, so it's pretty hard to justify giving it to Ilyana. And she does have the advantage that she doesn't have to train as much in the early game as Soren does. She joins at like level 7, whereas Soren joins at level 1, so she can skip that annoying part, but it is probably still easy enough to train Soren where it doesn't make up for the differences between them. And crit forges, of course, if you give Vantage to Ilyana, you use a crit forge, she still has enough magic to get one-shot thresholds. Her magic is a little bit lower than Soren's, but if you're invested into this kind of thing, you would be a fool not to give her like 1 or 2 Spirit Dust whenever you can. And Soren was so comfortably reaching one-shot thresholds that I think even without the Spirit Dusts, Ilyana on average will be able to one-shot with a Forged Thunder. And absolute worst case scenario, you just forge like 1 more Might on her Thunder Tome to make up for that. Because the difference between their average magics at like 21 is like 2 points, 2.5 maybe. It's really not that big, so 1 extra point of Might forged onto the Thunder makes up for that. So yeah, that works if you do that, but usually if you're not doing crit forges, then she's more like an okay investment, I would say. Next up is Mia, who is going to be, I think, the first sanity test. Let me just double check my old list. I made a list in advance that I'm peeking at every now and then, just to make sure I don't have any inconsistencies between what I had in mind and what I want to do. Mia, in the old list, I didn't put her in high effort. I said she was like an okay investment, acknowledging that you can use anyone in hard and you get away with it. Do not, I swear to God, do not expect Mia to be super good on Maniac after a bunch of effort, because you have less resources to work with and the payoff is still not great. There is still no 2-range with her. The only great thing, potentially great thing about Mia on Maniac compared to English Hard is on a Japanese version, of course, you can use Slim Swords with high crit. You can make a crit forge Slim Sword. And in theory, that sounds good. Because, you know, she has Vantage, so you can attack first, you get a crit. Usually that's a firm enough for success in Fire Emblem. And Mia doesn't even have to be a low HP like other users of that in other games, because Vantage always works. But the problem is that, A, Slim Swords are so expensive to forge. You need 19k for a full Might crit forge, and you're going to need that full Might crit forge because her strength is bad and sword might is bad. And even with the max might and like decent strength level ups, I just don't think she's going to reach one-shot thresholds. And if she's not one-shotting with Vantage crit, then the whole niche kind of goes out of the window. Like, you might as well use Zihark. Since his strength is better, he has a depth, so he just does the thing better. But you would need to give him Vantage, of course. But it's generally just not a good way of using resources. You're leaving potential power on the table, is the way I'd like to phrase it. There's some like light things you can do with her in the early game that make her good there, but she's nowhere near as good as someone like Shinon or Chadtrie at that point. So I don't even want to like go down that route of giving her credit for just for that. I just want to see her as like a long-term project, and she would be not a great use of your experience for sure. Use her when she's like convenient, but I wouldn't recommend adding her to your team unless you really like her. But I think if you like Mia, you probably enjoy playing normal or hard and just using her there than trying to do like crit forge things on Maniac. I think that would be a more enjoyable way of using her, but hey, you do you. This is just advice. I can't force you to do anything you don't want to. Similarly with Rolf, I don't think I have to be too elaborate here on why Rolf is not viable. Sure, he has the best stats out of all the snipers if you raise him all the way up before Shinon joins. I actually don't know if he's competitive with Shinon at like the highest possible level, but Rolf takes forever to grind. I grind him up in chapter 27 alone. Like, I used some bonus experience I saved to get into like level 7, and then I just like had him hit people from 2 range until he leveled up, promoted, etc. Would not recommend. It's pretty slow, but someone bribed me into doing it, and so I did it. And it was painful. But honestly, it was probably more easy than it was to train him as like a full-time part of the team. Rolf just doesn't offer anything you don't already having your team some way. Bows alone are not enough to justify using someone for the long term. Rolf's base stats are the worst in the game. He does only have double effectiveness even on flyers, so even killing like enemy wyverns is going to be hard for him. There's not that many good bows for him to use in the first place. There's some funny ones like longbow and double bow, but I wouldn't call them good. And yeah, there's just no reason to, other than if you want to, and in which case I'm not stopping you, but I'm telling you it's going to be a bit painful. Next up is Marcia, and I'm throwing her a no-brainer, but I immediately gotta say that I haven't tried. Wow, what's my voice doing today? I haven't used her on Maniac. The most obvious comparison to make is between her and Jill I did use. The age-old issue with the flyers is that Marcia has more speed, but Jill has more strength. They're actually not that far apart at levels 21. Let me ask Vil real quick, because I looked at this before, and the differences between them are actually not that massive, but they do exist, and they definitely come up every now and then. I thought Jill was a more intuitive choice, because I thought higher strength would be easier to work with than slightly lower speed. Marcia at 21 has 20.25 speed, so like about 20, whereas Jill is 4 points behind at 16.5 or so. Whereas Jill only has like 2 points extra of strength. Of course, Jill has axes, but in Japanese version, Marcia has the advantage of crit forges. Jill can use crit forges too, but there's no crit axes. So the extra might that Jill would use with a steel axe, for example, is kind of compensated for by Marcia just being able to use a slim lance anyway, and probably doing more damage. There were a lot of times where I had Jill use crit forges. I do think having a flyer is of a tremendous help. Like I said before, there's not many maps where you really want a flyer so badly to skip over things, but sometimes there's like side objectives. Some maps it's just really nice to have the ability to skip terrain to get to places quickly for emergencies or to help out from one team to the other. Think of like the Eat Rock chapter, think of like the Pitfall Bridge, think of the chapter where you're going to save Joffrey. There's just a lot of maps where just having a flyer is nice, especially if it doesn't have to be Tanith. Having like one that's really good at combat is just a good advantage to have. But I wouldn't recommend focusing on one because both Marcia and Jill need a lot of bonus experience, probably a couple lance crit forges over the course of the game, and they need kills fed to them as well to become viable. Like if you just have them level at a natural pace, only getting kills when they can and that's it, they're not going to be nearly as good. I also recommend saving your stat boosters for them, honestly. They're pretty good candidates for almost all of them. Angelic Robes, Speed Wings. Well, Speed Wings more so for Jill than for Marcia, but if your Marcia's falling behind on speed, I guess Speed Wings would be welcome for her. But especially Robes, Energy Drops, Draco Shields, all that works out super well because the better your flyer is at combat, the more flexible they become, and flyers are the best at being flexible. So there's almost no reason not to use their stat boosters on those. And hey, they're pretty girls, so I don't think most people will mind saving their stat boosters for Marcia and Jill. Rengor told me that he got a lot of mileage out of Marcia when he used her on Maniac, and the speed cap definitely made a difference for him. My Jill was doubling paladins in Clash, but on average she wouldn't be able to. Mine had at least one pair of speed wings on her and might have gotten a little bit speed blessed at the end. She got awful level ups early on, but she kind of compensated after she promoted with her level ups. So I imagine that Marcia would have an easier time reaching that benchmark. I think my Jill was able to one-round them comfortably with a Max Might Slim Lance Forge, with a crit of course, a double crit, whereas Marcia might have a bit of a harder time doing that because of the lower strength cap, even if she gets up to gets like all the level ups that she needs to get there in the first place. But I don't know the exact benchmarks for that. I just know that sometimes you'll be short on strength and sometimes you'll be short on speed, wishing you had the other one. But generally they should both be fine, and they're both gonna end up in no-brainer, like no spoilers here. In fact, I might as well just put Jill up here right now and save us the time to talk about her. They're not the same unit, but they do almost the same thing once they have both joined and you gave them both stat boosters and leveled them both up a lot. I guess one thing I should really bring up, and I've been comparing these two already, is that Jill has significantly lower res than Marcia, which usually is not a big deal when comparing units, but for Maniac Mode, where long-range magic happens a lot, having high res on Marcia is nice. The difference is about 7 points. If I look at their 21 averages, and it's gonna just become bigger over time because Marcia's res growth is better. Usually defense is more important than res, and I would say it still is on Maniac. The defense difference is also like kind of big. It's 3 to 4 points in favor of Jill. But res matters a lot more than in other games here because there's so much long-range magic. I imagine that, I guess depending on your provoke allocation, which flyer is best for you might change a little bit. Like, if you put Provoke on Soren, and that basically trivializes all the long-range magic, and so you might be able to get away with using Jill more. Whereas if you put your Provoke on, I don't know, Chadtrie or a more physically inclined unit, then conversely, it might be better to use Marcia, because you can bait all the physical enemies from her, and you're more concerned about magic that hits the Provoke unit. But I guess you also wouldn't really care too much either way if you're using Provoke to bait away all the enemies. I would recommend throwing Provoke on these two, by the way. They're not bulky enough to survive that. Even Jill, she was my more bulky unit by the end, like one of the top 3 or so, and she could sustain more front lines at the end of the game, but I would still recommend keeping an eye on her, because she's not going to be as durable as you're used to from English Hard. Okay, stay hydrated. We need Lethe and Mordecai next, and I'm going to go ahead and just put them in good, no investment. Both of them, really. They are not long-term great training projects. They have good growth, but their XP gain is just too slow to take advantage of them. And eventually their drawbacks are going to catch up with them. But they do have big stats when you get them early on. Like for chapters, I want to say it's 9 through 14, 15 or so. They hold their own pretty well. They kind of change shifts from each other. Lethe starts transformed, and then by the time that she untransforms, Mordecai is usually transformed, depending on how much combat they both did in that stage. And Lethe is faster, usually 1-rounds early on, and kind of stops 1-rounding eventually, whereas Mordecai can double Armor Knights and maybe some other stuff if he gets lucky, but generally it's just Armor Knights. But he does so much damage that he kills in 2 rounds anyway. And they're both pretty good for that. I also like Mordecai's Smite. He can smite just about anyone. Lethe can also shove a heck of a lot of people. I found him really useful in the prison chapter. I did manage to get stealth there. I screwed up a movement once, and that just ended it after 50 turns. But if you are trying to get the stealth bonus in chapter 10, I would recommend deploying, I think, one or both of them to try and get that done. And just generally good filler units for as long as you have them, and you don't really need to put work into them. I liked using them a lot. Mordecai actually ended up being number 5 most kills on my playthrough somehow, because I killed off a lot of people that got more kills, but let's not talk about that part. And he was just a really nice, comfy guy. Mordecai also has a water affinity, so it makes a good support partner for anyone who will have him. I had it with Mist, which didn't really end up doing a whole lot, but it was cool in theory. And I guess Lethe can support Jill, which is okay, I guess. It gives Jill her own Thunder affinity mirrored back at her, but Heaven affinity doesn't really do a whole lot. I guess more hit is nice on Maniac sometimes. Some enemies are really dodgy. Paladins are kind of fast, Swordmasters are kind of fast, but generally I don't think that support is going to see too much play. They're both fine, but not all that different from Maniac from my experience. Late game, you're still going to fall behind due to lack of 2 range, gauge upkeep being harder since the enemy density is higher, and the Demi Band is usually sufficient to keep him transformed, of course, but not sufficient to keep him in a state where they're really good at fighting. Next up, we have Volke, and Volke is really useful, and I like him a lot, and of course he is special utility like he was before. Stealing stuff in this game is pretty nice, mostly physics stabs. I think those are the best things for him to steal, and fortunately he has the strength at base to get them, unlike Sothe, who we'll get into in a minute. And that alone I think is worth special utility. Of course he also opens doors and chests, particularly useful in chapter 10, because he doesn't trigger the stealth undo thing. He doesn't make you unstealthy by doing it, unlike anyone breaking a door with their axe. I guess opening chests with a chest key is the same thing. Door keys would also work. We don't have that many in this game at that point in the game. So yeah, Volke is pretty good for that. And there's a couple of other chapters where just getting chests is nice. The 50 gold, I don't think is a big deal that he charges for every lock. It exists, I guess, but it doesn't change your finances big enough. The big expenses in this game, they cost a lot more than 50 gold each, and probably using Volke throughout the entire game is not going to prevent you of doing anything that you couldn't do before. Plus the money he gets you through opening chests is usually going to pay for itself. So yeah, I think Volke is very, very good. You do not have enough chest keys to get everything you want without him, and so he's almost like a guaranteed deploy everywhere. I actually trained him as a combat unit in Maniac for fun. I don't think it was good enough to recommend anyone do that, but technically his growths are good. It's just that knives are really, really bad in this game. No one-to-range knives that you can get, very, very low might, no ability to forge them, unlike in Radiant Dawn, which is what made them so good there. And just generally not enough strength to one-round things to compensate for the low might. That's just the problems that he faces. He has Shade, which, if you heard me talk about Provoke, you might expect Shade to somehow matter more, but not really. In fact, he died because Shade didn't work I think the problem was we were in the Ena chapter, the Danekeep chapter, another chapter with a lot of long-range tomes, and it was kind of edging along the area where the throne room area where Ena is. You have like 3 stages running around with different long-range magics, and I thought Volke would be somewhat safe because he has Shade and he wasn't getting one-shot, but he got put to sleep by an enemy, and apparently in Path of Radiance that reduces your avoid by a lot. I don't remember if it's like -20 avoid or if it just makes you a guaranteed target, or like a guaranteed hit if your target is put to sleep, but either way he got targeted, got hit twice and died, and that's how I lost my thief, as well as a bunch of gear, as well as a bunch of future gear that I could no longer steal because I no longer had Volke, and it was really unfortunate because I put a lot of work into him. I got him to level 20, promoted him, and then he just died soon after. Very unfortunate. Fun to use though, and it didn't really cost me a whole lot to get him to that point. Like, training units is, I know I said it's difficult, but I was taking such a long time and grinding so hard on some maps that it didn't really impact much of anything. But generally the best way to use Volke is just to run around, steal things occasionally, get physics for your healers and your Soren and your Ilyana if you get to staff rank, and just kind of enable other units that way. But you don't worry too much about his combat. It is nice that he survives one hit, at least usually. That's what kind of stands up, makes him stand out compared to Sothe. I'm gonna put Sothe in special utility as well, but noting that he's much worse, and having to deal with him over Volke was a kind of a headache. There were not many chapters after my Volke died that I had to deal with Sothe. One of them could have been the chapter called Solo, where you have to shove a bunch of priests out of the way, but I ended up just killing the boss on turn 1 there with long range magic, and so it wasn't relevant. And I think after that you don't really have any chapters where a thief is super relevant. There's like the chapter where before you fight the Black Knight, that one has a couple chests, but it also has a bunch of thieves, and those will drop the treasure if you kill them before they after take the treasure. And then you can get some other stuff with chest keys, and so I think I missed out on like 2 treasure that way, neither of them which were very relevant. It's like a silver weapon and a Bolganon tome, something like that. It might be different things, but I think it was that. Chapter 27, I want to say. Rolf was trained in chapter 28, I just remembered. Chapter 27 is when the chapter where you fight, I think his name is Hafed, and the Black Knight, of course. Anyway, I'm trailing, but the point was Sothe doesn't really matter all that much after he joins. There's a couple chapters where a thief is nice, but you should have Volke available for those, and if you're playing an Iron Man and your Volke died, replacing him with Sothe or using both doesn't really matter all that much. I think I deployed both for one chapter, which is the chapter where Astrid joins, and getting all the chests before the Ravens could get to them was nice, but it was a small deal and ultimately probably replaceable with chest keys anyway. Sothe is okay, but keeping him away from like long range tomes is going to be a big pain, and generally it's not worth deploying a second thief. So special utility, but way less useful than Volke. For a tier list, I put him quite a bit lower. Alright, it's time for one of my favorite units here. It's Kieran. I think Kieran is very good, and I'm going to put him in good investment, with a couple of caveats. Mine got RNG screwed, so right now I am sour on Kieran. I'm just warning you. I think he's not... He wasn't very good in my playthrough, and he ended up dying, in fact. But the problem for him was just that he got like -4 on strength or something. His other stats were like okay, but normally Kieran is one of the few mounted units who has a bazunga amount of strength. When he joins, people like to say he has like roughly the same stats as Titania at base, which is true. But what I think stands out the most from him is that he just gets like enormous amounts of strength over the course of the playthrough, and he has like a good axe rank. Like, people usually have to get by with like steel axes, 4 steel axes, which are all well and good, but Kieran can get 4 silver axes, which is even better. But yeah, Kieran is like a base 11 strength and 50% growth, which means that at 21, I'm checking my numbers here, he's got 17 strength, which is pretty big. It's more than Oscar would have at that point, for instance. Oscar on average has like 15 to 16. It's not a big difference, not as big as I remember, but it's gonna enlarge over the course of the game. And if your Oscar, you know, gets RNG screwed, I guess Kieran is even more welcome. If he gets blitzed, of course, I guess it's less relevant. But really, you should be using both. You should be using both Kieran and Oscar. Support them together. Use that air support. Kieran's affinity is not that great. I believe it's wind, which is like kind of whatever, but at least it gives a void, right? Right? I think so. It's pretty nice, and yeah, I think he's a really good mounted unit, and he joins early enough to where training him is still viable, but late enough where his bases at least are still somehow capable of keeping up, if that makes sense. Like, he's one of the few units that joins like halfway through, but doesn't need a bunch of bonus experience. A little bit is welcome. And he also joins like right before the Night Mode comes in. So his speed growth is effectively, instead of having, what was it, like 40%, he has like 70% effectively, as long as you keep the Night Ward on him for a while. I know I said for a lot of units that the Night Ward is important to have, and Kieran is one of the units I recommended on the most, but I know I also said put it on Titania, put it on Oscar, put it on Astrid. You have to figure this stuff out yourself, of course, but know that Kieran is just another really good user of it. And other than that, I mean, if you're here this far into the video, you probably know what Kieran is and what he does, so I'm not going to go too elaborate. After promotion, you probably still want lances just as an extra option. I guess it gives you the crit forge option. I haven't explored that myself because I didn't really use Kieran all that much. When he was being a good filler, I did give him the crit forge at some points, but it wasn't like super impactful or anything. But it was a nice option, and because axes don't have that, it's, you know, it's cool. And I think he would have this position regardless of whether he has crit forges or not. I would never put him like below or higher than this. I don't think he gets a whole lot worse or better from Hard or Maniac. This is basically the same place he was in on the previous list. The reason he's not a no-brainer is because all these do something enormously broken at some point in the game, or even for the entire game. Titania like trivializes the first half of it. Soren and Ilyana trivialize the mid and late game, and Marcia and Jill's flyeriness is just so unique and so nice to have that having them a no-brainer is nice. If I would move anything closer together, I would move the flyers down to good investments. But either way, they're healthy, they're like hardy. Is it the word hardy recommendations for all these units? So I don't think I would like put too much stock in who goes in no-brainer and who goes in good no investments or good investments. Nephenee is another sanity test, I am afraid. Again, a unit that needs a lot of resources, doesn't do very well. I know there are people who have done very well with Nephenee in Maniac, but I'm not one of them. I haven't used her for a whole lot. If you think she's an okay investment, then by all means keep using her. I know the Night Ward will work on her to give her a lot of speed. I just think her strength is insufficient to get one-shots at first. She does have Wrath, but giving her advantage over like a Sage seems like a waste to me. I suppose if you have no crit forges, then Nephenee becomes a bit better by comparison, possibly, but I'm not sure if she can really get the like one-shots necessary with Vantage Wrath to make do. What I'm afraid of when using Nephenee, and maybe some more Nephenee users can enlighten me in the chat, in the comments, is like if she falls below half health and then activates Wrath to get more crits with like a Killer Lance, first of all, her crit will be like 80%, but it won't be 100%, so you have like a 20% chance to effectively miss your wanted KO. And second, I don't think she one-shots consistently, especially not on Maniac, especially with so many enemies having like 1-2 range or 3-10 range. I think trying to take advantage of Vantage Wrath with Nephenee is going to be potentially deadly for her and result in like a reset very far into a map. And if you don't try to do that, then she doesn't really have a niche over all the units. Like if you're not trying to take advantage of Wrath, then she's just statistically worse than all the units over here. So I just don't see the point in like trying to carry with Nephenee super hard. But hey, if you think that she's decent, then by all means go use her. But I don't think she's going to be worth your time if you're looking for like good units. Brom, I'm going to put him in okay investments very hesitantly. I was going to like put him down here as well, but I looked at his stats compared to Chadtrie and they're not that far apart. They're kind of close actually. So Chadtrie joins earlier, of course, he does the early game utility, but this is a character guide, not a tier list, so it's not really about what is the most utility, but who's like, what would I recommend using, right? And so Brom is just going to be roughly the same level as Chadtrie when he rejoins probably. Chadtrie is going to be around for the early game, then rejoins in the Astrid chapter, whereas Brom has to be around for, I think that's 3 more maps before Chadtrie rejoins at that point. So they both have got a couple of levels. You can argue which one gets like more, but they should be about equal. Brom has worse strength by a fair bit. His base is 10, Chadtrie has 2 more at base, and then Brom also has a lower growth by 10%, so his strength is going to be worse. Speed is a bit better though. They have the same growth, but Brom has 2 more base speed, so he'll be relying on the Night Ward a little bit less, but still it'll take out forever for both of them to double. Chadtrie has more defense, but only by a little bit. Like 5% growth and like 1 base doesn't really change a whole lot. Chadtrie has worse res, again only by 2 points. So the differences between them are not that large, I think. They even have the same weapon ranks and everything. So ultimately, I think it just comes down to whoever you like more, and I personally prefer Chadtrie, just from like having used him and not having used Brom. Maybe you don't feel like freeing Brom from his prison cell, you just want to skip that part, going all the way to the bottom right, but you probably want to go there for Kieran anyway, so I don't think that's a big difference maker. I think Chadtrie feels easier to use intuitively, but realistically there's not a big difference between him and Brom, I think, so he should be good for all the reasons that Chadtrie is good. But it was still like a pretty heavy resource investment into Chadtrie, and I'm assuming that Brom would need roughly the same resources to function, so I'm going to put him in the same place. Then we have Zihark, who I'm also hesitantly going to put in okay investment, acknowledging that he might, and I have actually seen people put him in sanity test instead. I don't think, like I said before, I don't think there's a whole lot of places in Maniac for sword users because the emphasis on 1-2 range is just so much bigger, and I just don't think Zihark has the attack to compete. But he does have Adept, he does have the ability to use like higher rank swords when few other people can. There's like one other unit rate later that's going to be relevant that can use high rank swords, and then maybe one more. There's like a place for Maniac in high speed units in the fact that they can reliably double some enemies that most units can't. I brought up before the Paladins are fairly high speed, there's also like Ravens, but I think for Ravens, the ones that are around when Zihark is around, I don't think he doubles them at base, so it's going to take some luck for him to double them, and by the time they come back, like you fight like Ravens in chapter 18, at that point they're not a threat anymore, you don't really care about them, so having Zihark for those doesn't really change anything. I don't think he really doubles enemy Swordmasters that reliably. I also don't think he's the best person to take them on because his defenses are lower, and just generally I don't think he's a great frontline unit, and I also don't think he really assassinates enemy units very well to justify his lower defense on the battlefield. I just don't think he does a whole lot. But I do think as a flunky filler kind of unit, he's like okay, so you could put him like in filler. This tier, you'll see why this tier is here right away. I know it's still empty, but you'll see why it's here. But I think he's like fine at base. You can kind of give him a spin while you have the deployment slots, but I don't think he's great. Astrid is going to be our last good investment. You can see I'm very strict on what I'm putting in that tier. For all the reasons that she usually is on hard, good XP gain thanks to Paragon, comes with the Night Ward, and so she can use the Night Ward right away. Maybe get a couple Raven kills during joining chapter. Maybe you can set up a formation in the chapter after that, in the Fog of War chapter, where she can grind a bunch of kills on like pirates or bandits or whatever they're called in that chapter, the Makalov chapter. She's very easy to train. You just have to keep her safe. I didn't manage to keep her safe in my Iron Man, but it was my fault, not hers. I haven't been able to use her long term, but I've been told that she's excellent. Her speed is actually really, really high, to the point where I would expect her to be able to double all the hard targets to double, including Paladins. Like, if you just take Astrid and level her up all the way to 21, even without the Night Ward, she's going to reach like 17 to 18 speed. If you add like 19 Night Ward level ups to that, that's like 30% of to roughly 20, let's say 21. So like 7 extra speed level ups from that, that's like 24 speed. That is enough to double almost every enemy that is going to be relevant. You can pick up steel axes, or you can pick up lances for crit forges, depending on whether you're playing with crit forges or not. And I know I said bows are not a very big deal, and they're not super useful to have, but it's an option that she has in addition to what's probably going to be her main weapon after promotion. And sometimes you want to shoot down a flyer, sometimes you want to just brave bow something to death, and you're going to have a lot of people who want to use like the brave lance or the brave axe, but you won't have anyone using the brave bow most likely. So those weapons are going to be sitting in your convoy going unused. Trading someone just for the purposes of using those, not really worth it. But if you already have someone who can use them, who is good regardless of them, then being able to use those is like an extra perk, is the way I want to say that. Just so you know, it's not a double standard here. I just think bows are not that great, but if you have the option to use them, you might as well utilize them when they do come in handy, the couple times that they do, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think Astrid is good. It is a bit of an investment, of course, but it shouldn't be so much that it like interferes with trying to raise like these units, for instance. Next up is Makalov, who is like a worse version of Astrid in that sense, because no Paragon. Swords probably about as good or bad, however you want to see it, as bows, and like okay bases, I guess, but not all that good. I'll put him in okay investments because still a paladin, I guess, but really not that great, and I wouldn't highly recommend using him, but like whatever, it's fine probably. Still haven't really given him a go the whole time. You can see that's like the same tier as he got in a hard mode. Don't really have a lot to say on Makalov. I already went over how crit forges for swords are not a big deal, but you can use axes or lances if you really want to use crit forges, but probably just pick axes. But if you want to use him, if you can stomach him, then go ahead. Torgod, I was like having trouble where to put Tormod. There was a funny post on Seren's Force with like recommendations for a Maniac team that I think Fish's Cell sent to me that really highly recommend using Tormod because he's the only mage with a bunch of movement. I don't think Tormod really fits what you want to do with Maniac Mode. I think he has too many disadvantages, but I'm still going to put him in okay investment because I think there are worse. I don't think he's a sanity test, but a BXP hungry unit should be giving some kind of massive return, and I don't think there really is one for Tormod. He's a mage, but I think he requires more backspin than Soren and Ilyana. You can still do crit forge funnies with him, but the problem is that celerity, from what I recall, takes up 15 capacity. So at least unpromoted, he can't do both Vantage and celerity, so that advantage would be kind of gone if you gave it to him then. I'm not sure if he can do it after promotion, but let's assume he can. Then you're still just kind of getting the same thing. And you can't do like, you can only do 2 skills max of 10 capacity, but you probably can't do, I'm pretty sure you can't do celerity, vantage, and provoke. So that's another option that he just loses. He also can't do adept in conjunction, but adept is not that important if you have crit forges. If you don't have crit forges, then you don't have crit thunder for Tormod, and so he's just kind of like hard mode but worse. He's just an XP hungry sage with not a whole lot of great benchmarks. I don't think a Tormod that's actually been raised compares very well to an actual leveled unit, whether it's Soren or Ilyana or someone else, but it's just easy to compare him to the other mages, right? Because they're kind of, to get an idea of what he does. If you compare like an average 21 Soren to a 21 Tormod, Soren is actually worse in magic and in speed, and that's assuming that Soren somehow didn't get like a massive level 8. Tormod has like a slight defense advantage of like 2 to 3 points, but it's not enough to reach like big thresholds where he gets 2 shots, where Soren gets 1 shot, or he gets 3 shot, whereas Soren gets 2 shot. Like, it just doesn't happen very much. I suppose with the Laguz Guard, there's more possibilities of that happening, but generally I wouldn't hold your breath for Tormod's redemption. Why are the units falling off my list? Let me take a look at that. But yeah, Tormod is kind of the same as he is in Maniac, but now he requires even more relative investment because Bixp is more scarce. Okay, they're no longer falling off my overlay. On with the show. Muarim is pretty much the same as he is in hard mode, in that he's good filler deploy, kind of like replaces your Lethes and your Mordecais when that happens. Good user of the demi band that he comes with, and just a good guy all around. I didn't deploy him a whole lot because I was running low on deployment slots at that point, but he was alright, and you should probably deploy him while it makes sense and then ditch him afterwards. Good, no investment needed. Just a good guy to have around. Could probably take the Smite Scroll if you needed to, but I never really found that super relevant. It's just alright. Again, one range, lack of 1-2 range is going to catch up with him at some point. He's probably not going to double a whole lot in the late game, but he's alright. He's fine. There's not a whole lot to say about him. I wish I had more to say about him, but he's pretty much the same as he is normally, and I think you already know he's good to use, but not like massively good. Stefan is also roughly the same. I had some like talks about Stefan with Rengar and Co, because I was like, he seems kind of bad to me, like kind of whatever. I'm kind of back and forth on how much exactly I value having like hand axes or javelins at all. Stefan being locked to 1 range means that he will never counter most of the enemies past chapter 18, and his durability at that point is also not very good. But at the same time, he joins with like endgame ready stats and just the ability to use a Vekati when almost no one else is going to be able to use that ever, perhaps. Like, I had it on Ike as a filler weapon for a couple chapters, but it really would have been much better used on Stefan. But I also think when Stefan joins is like chapter 15, basically chapter 16, that's like the easiest point in the game because your units are going to be around promoted and the enemies will still be mostly bad. So he's just like a really good unit for a period where you really don't need that kind of unit. Like, he's superfluous more likely, and he's also unmounted, so he's going to take up like action economy for your mounted units when you rather transport like Boyd or Soren or Ilyana or maybe Chadtrie or Brom or some of these other people. And then on top of that, he doesn't really offer that much. You can't really put him out there, fight a bunch of enemies, and be happy with what he's done. He's not particularly the best person to set up kills if he's not one-run killing, because he always has a chance to proc Astra or critical an enemy. And then after chapter 18, he just doesn't counter a whole lot, and he's like fine, but I think you will almost always at that point have better units to deploy than Stefan, or units that you want to deploy even if they're worse statistically. Like if you're going through a playthrough but you're training like Tormod or Makalov for fun, you're not going to replace them with Stefan even if Stefan is better. So in that sense, I just don't think there's a whole lot of practical uses for him. But at the same time, guy has like a bunch of stats that are really high, and a lot of the time you won't always have one to range all our units, in which case you might as well expose Stefan and just accept that you're not going to counter every enemy, which is completely fine. So he's good. I just have some personal pet peeves, and that's why I didn't use him a whole lot. He's okay. Devdan is a sanity test. I accidentally ended up killing him in my playthrough. Wouldn't recommend that, but also wouldn't really recommend deploying him. I think we're slowly getting into the point where I'm going to talk about how bad the late game pre-promotes are, or the mid-late game pre-promotes. I kind of briefly mentioned it with Stefan, but it's much more apparent with Devdan, and especially the units over here, like Calill and Haar, especially in Ranulf. These units are a lot worse off in Maniac. The enemies improve a lot more, like around chapter 20, between Hard and Maniac, whereas the basis of these units are unchanged from Hard mode. And so someone like Chadtrie, or someone like Joffrey, loses 1v1s to a bunch of enemies, or at least just doesn't put in enough work to warrant deploying. Like even with a high tier weaponry, they're just not doing all that well. And so that's kind of like all they can do. Like if they're only around for a portion of the game where they're struggling, they're really not that good. So normally I would use a unit, I would put a unit that's like kind of okay in like okay no investment, but I just don't think there is an okay no investment tier for Maniac. I think these units are just fillers, or they're just not good, and I think Devdan, with his lack of stats, is just not good. He does have the ability to use crit forges, and he also has the ability to use Luna. I didn't mention this for Chadtrie, but those things are incompatible. You can crit with the crit forges, or you can Luna, but you can't do both. And from what I can tell, Luna is rolled first. So if you give Luna, if you give an occult scroll to Chadtrie or Devdan, for example, and give him crit forge, around like 20% of the time or something, 10% of the time, they're gonna Luna and not crit. And it just usually worsens their damage output, because Luna like halves enemy defense for an attack, and that's gonna be less extra damage than a crit, usually, unless you're fighting a general maybe, but generally it's bad. So don't combine those two, do like one of the two things. But either way, Devdan is going to be bad, and he's going to need a bunch of stat boosters and favoritism to get going, and he's already promoted, so there's not a whole lot of improving that, so I wouldn't recommend using Devdan. Tanith is really good. Really, really good. Her stats have the same problem that Stefan and Devdan have, I guess, where like they're not going to improve a whole lot from when she joins, because, I mean, you already promoted, you're not going to get your promo bonuses, and so what she has is kind of what she's got, which is fine. Like, she has enough speed to double, so if you have a good enough forge, you can make her double. You can give her a forged silver if she gets A rank lances, or you give her a forged silver sword, I guess, but that seems really expensive. Sonic sword is kind of good against wyverns. It doesn't 1-round KO from the top of my head, but like 3-hit KO, so it's pretty good still. It's 1 to 2 range, and her combat is like passable. I wish she had more bulk. I think if you somehow didn't train Marcia or Jill, but you have like all your stat boosters lying around, giving the Tanith is probably a good move. She would probably make good use of them. I think a big problem for Tanith is that you only have one full guard, and so against enemy snipers, it's always like, okay, do I give it to one of these two units and then leave the other one out of combat? I think it's better to have one flyer for combat and then just leave the other one out of combat almost entirely, and for me it ended up being using Jill for combat, giving her the full guard, leaving Tanith out. Even if you give Tanith the full guard, she probably still takes enough damage from snipers where you can't just ignore them. They're still annoying, but they don't like two-shot her anymore, but it's still a lot of damage you'd rather not take. You know what I mean? It's still not optimal to have Tanith frontline most of the time. But Reinforce is too good. Reinforce is insane. It's like having a summoner. Someone posted that in the comments to my other Maniac video. Tanith is basically a summoner. Summons 2 Pegasus Knights and a Falcon Knight, all of them with capped speed, so the Pegasus Knights have like 20 and the Falcon Knight I think is like 28. The promoted guy with the Silver Lance is like better than Tanith. He kills a lot of things. He might not 1-round like every enemy around, but he does so much damage. The Pegasus Knights usually die in one round, but that's good actually, because that means they provoke enemies into attacking them, no pun intended, and that keeps your Ilyana units safe. If you have like a lot of long-range enemies around that are giving you trouble, putting these guys in range will be great. You gotta remember that any turn where you have reinforcements on the field, or you are planning to do so, don't move Ike until you've done your reinforce, because if you've moved Ike, you cannot direct the reinforcements again. I made this mistake a lot, and I don't think it cost me anyone in particular, but it's just a mistake that you should try to avoid. The reinforcements are really nice baits, and they can do a lot of work for you. They can sometimes kill enemies if they get a little bit lucky and sneak by the enemy front lines and kill like an enemy sage with bolting somewhere. It's kind of manipulable what they get to target. They use the same AI as the enemies, and it's usually kind of predictable. If you have like an enemy that you're trying to kill, but you end up missing a bunch of hits, like if Boyd decides to miss all his attacks, then if the enemy is lying around with like 2 HP, you can be pretty certain that the reinforcements are going to try and pick him off, for instance. So they can be manipulated into doing what you want a lot of the time. They're not always going to succeed. They're still NPCs. They might still do stupid shit. But oftentimes I do recommend leaving them on roam just to get use of their extra attacks. Or targeting them to an area so that the long-range tomes can reach them. So, highly recommend deploying Tanith every chapter. And even if she sees 0 combat in your whole playthrough, she'll probably be one of your MVPs past chapter 18. I think Reinforce is just that good. But at the same time, if you do want to make use of Tanith as a combat unit, you know, it's probably worth it to save some stat boosters for her. Maybe give her a little bit of Bex if you want to. Her growth are quite good. Save the full guard for sure. Just do all the things you would usually do to make flyers good, but you don't need as much Bex for her, and that's nice. Reyson, also a no-brainer. Even more so than in the English version. When you have that choice of whether to take Reyson or not, if you say no, you lose out on him, you lose out on Janaf and Olki, which, okay, whatever. And then you get the renewal scroll, which is great because you can only use the renewal scroll on Alincia and on Ena, both characters that already have renewal. I don't know why. That's only the case in Japanese as far as I know. It's very funny. It's very terrible. You also cannot sell the renewal scroll. It's completely worthless. I love it. So you say yes, you get Reyson, and then he's a dancer, and then if you use a Laguz Stone on him or you wait 5 turns, he's a quadruple dancer that flies, and if you talk to Nasala, then you get the Night Ring, and then he's a quadruple dancer that can also move after dancing. There you go. That's really good. I don't think I have to explain this a whole lot. Is it better or worse on Hard or Maniac? I don't know. Use them both. He's really, really nice. There's a lot of good Canto units in the game, as you can see here, and even units without Canto deserve another turn most of the time. There were a lot of times where I would Vigor Soren, for instance, to either like bolting someone or heal someone. I would Vigor Mist a lot to do like a double heal in a turn. There's just so many things that you can do with Reyson. It's really nice. He can be shoved by a bunch of characters as well to get him in and out of enemy range. It's really nice that he has an insanely high res stat, so you don't have to protect him from long range magic. In fact, I would frequently leave him in range, hoping they would target him. They usually didn't. They're kind of smart about it. They know that, you know, a unit with like 20 plus res is not a great target for long range magic. I think he's only weak to flyer effective things when he's transformed for some reason, even though he flies in both forms. And so you don't have to be super careful about ballistas when he's untransformed. I think you usually take a hit from those, but be careful anyway because he is fragile and losing him really sucks. You don't want to like either lose him in an Iron Man or restart like a whole ass chapter just for Reyson. But it's usually worth to do so because he's just that special. Yeah, very versatile, but I think I said pretty much everything I wanted to say about Reyson in like the pitfalls about dancers, so screw it. You already know what to do. Next up is the Hawk Laguz, Janaf and Olki. Janaf, as usual, is gonna go like, it's like, okay, you can use him. He's a filler. I think he's one of the first, like, probably the best example of like a unit that just kind of doesn't really hold up in this kind of difficulty. Just doesn't do enough damage to really warrant deploying most of the time. But at least starts out transformed, so you don't have to like invest like a demi band or anything else into him. He just kind of does his thing for like 3-4 turns, 5 turns, and then just kind of flies off and does nothing else for the rest of the chapter. That's like okay to deploy. It's not terrible. It's probably better than some unpromoted scrub. Like you'd rather deploy base Janaf than base, well, most of these units honestly. So yeah, Janaf is okay, but I haven't really used them a whole lot. I only deployed them from the Sala chapter, I think, and that's about it. Olki is a sanity test because you have to deal with all the issues Janaf has, but also he starts untransformed. I think he has like the slowest Laguz gauge, in fact, so he's like the same gauge as Mordecai. He just doesn't start with any gauge and he has to slowly build it up. He just kind of sucks. Next up is Calill, and Calill is interesting because she has roughly the same magic as Soren and Ilyana would have, again, at 21. They'll be far beyond 21, but I think there's a chance that with crit forges, Calill could one-shot the enemies when she joins, maybe with like a Spirit Dust that you could save for her. I do think in practice it's much better to have Soren and Ilyana trained up, ready to go with Vantage Crit Forge than it is to wait for Calill because she joins quite late and you're missing out on a lot of potential kills if you do this kind of thing. So I don't think it's worth saving Vantage for Calill, but in theory, you could use her the same way. She just wouldn't get as much bang for your buck for it. But I would still say she's good no investments rather than like a filler, given what she can potentially do. Even if you don't give her Vantage, you have someone who can do quite a lot of damage for, well, not little cost, but the cost of 1 forge. And then she'll have like 41 shots lined up, basically. That's fairly good, especially in conjunction with the utility that she already had, even on English hard, so like long-range tomes. Unfortunately, no staff utility, but like chip damage if you wanted it, I guess. With no crit forges, it will probably roughly be the same thing, but there'd be less space for it. But for example, the 1 turn of the priest shoving chapter, the should have brought more babies chapter, that's another thing where Calill can come in handy. I do think she's fine, but I don't think she's a replacement for Soren and Ilyana as much as like a unit that you can use the same way when she joins, but probably will just be a filler. Tauroneo, I think, is also interesting. I guess he is to Chadtrie and Brom what Calill is to Soren and Ilyana, a late game replacement with much worse stats. He joins with like 13 speed from the top of my head, or maybe his level is 13, but either way it's very low speed. I'm just going to look it up right now because I think 13 might actually be his level that I'm thinking of. The point is that he's just way too low at speed. Yeah, he's level 14 with 13 speed. So even if you gave him the Night Ward for every one of his levels and he got it 60, that gives him 60% speed growth and he got it every time, he still wouldn't cap speed. Now normally I'm not big about like hitting caps, but the problem is that the general speed cap isn't even enough to double like paladins reliably, and Tauroneo falls below that. Base he actually gets doubled by generals, and he joins so late. Day and Keep from the top of my head, like the end of Day and Keep effectively, so there's not a whole lot of room for doing things. I keep referencing this whenever Tauroneo is brought up, but there was a funny Maniac, I think, speedrun that Aggro posted to me that has an arm scrolled Tauroneo with like S-rank swords using the Vague Kadi and Night Ward to get like 35 defense going in Clash. Quite funny. It's only for as long as the Vague Kadi lasts, but the fact that he doesn't counter out 2 range might make it last a bit longer than you might think. Hammer, I guess, also exists, but theoretically he has really high defense, and he's got more sword rank than Brom and Chadtrie will ever have. So that's like a funny thing he can do. He has Resolve, which fortunately isn't as bad as it is in Radiant Dawn Japanese. Below 50%. Get 1.5 times his strength and speed. It's quite good. I think skill as well, come to think of it. It's pretty good. It's pretty strong. He does kind of need Resolve to ever double anything. And the problem with Resolve is, of course, you have to be below half HP, so his durability gets cut in half that way. And that's not great, but there's probably some things he can do. I think you could put him like almost anywhere and justify it in some way. I'm going to throw him in like okay investments because I think it'd be more interesting to look at him as like an investment project that you try to do something with Resolve. Maybe Speed Wings, maybe Night Ward, try to get him to tank. You could just use him for like no investment, but I think there's like barely any payoff there. If he didn't get doubled, he would have a bigger payoff, but as is, his defense isn't high enough to take 0 damage, and when you're not taking 0 damage, you're taking double damage from everything that attacks you. And at that point, I think his tankiness gets a bit lost, but Resolve is interesting. There's probably something you can do with Tauroneo, but I wouldn't highly recommend him. He's alright, I guess. He was fun to deploy for a couple chapters until he freaking died for me. Haar, I think, is quite nice. I'm trying to see where I end up putting him. I threw him in filler. I don't actually think Haar is bad. I think he's probably the best of the late game units that we've had lined up here. Maybe with like 1 or 2 exceptions that I'm not seeing right now. He's still a filler. Like, I don't think he is like good like these guys are. But he does fly, so you could argue he goes up there. He supports Jill for one, which is quite nice. Jill doesn't have many supporters that can like keep up with her. And Haar's Thunder, I think he has a Thunder affinity. No, he's Wind. Never mind, he's not that good. Still, he's nice. He's possibly a good user to Brave Axe. You might want to give the Brave Axe to someone who's likely to quad with it. Like if you're a Boyd, it's got enough speed, or you got like enough Axe rank on one of your Paladins, or Kieran can use it, then that's probably better. But Haar is like an okay user of it if you don't have like a great target for it. He comes with it, but that's not the reason to give it to him. The reason to give it to him is that he actually does work with it. He does not have enough speed to double almost anything, so mostly he's just going to be chip damage. And chip damage from a physical unit, I find, often comes down to doing like 13 damage to an enemy with like 40 to 50 HP. That's not great. So it's usually more about the flyer utility, rescue dropping people. I've used him frequently to like use Reyson to dance like very close to the enemy lines, and then use Haar to get him out of there. Sometimes even dancing for Haar for that purpose, and then dancing for 3 actual units that were going to do something. That is something I sometimes do, and it's helpful, better than nothing. So for that alone, you could do them in good no investment. Really, these tiers, categories are almost interchangeable now looking at it, but I like them all being a single line, so we're gonna keep it this way. But yeah, he's alright. He's fine. He's not fantastic, but he always surprises me with how nice he is. I think I deploy him for almost every chapter that I had him. Just even though his combat isn't massively great, he still can crit forge stuff with the Slim Lance, and even without that, he has some uses, but it's mostly about just, you know, flying around. Ranulf is definitely a filler character that I don't think has a need for a lot of explanation. Where did I put this guy? Oh, he's also a filler. He just joined earlier than Haar. Yeah, he does join earlier than Haar. Okay, that makes sense. He joins at the beginning of the chapter where Haar joined, so I was like confused why I didn't go to him first. He's, I think he's another example of a unit that just doesn't really keep up with enemy stats. I gave him the Demi Band, and from my experience, he doesn't double a whole lot of relevant characters. I don't remember exactly for super certain if he doubled Paladins or not, or anything else, but damage output wasn't very impressive. I think his bases are higher than Muarim, so if you've been using Muarim up to this point, you can just replace him 1-to-1, trade the Demi Band over and be done with it, and it's probably an improvement, but not a significant one to the point where I would say he's like better. And because he joined so late, and you're gonna have better options at this point, because the benchmark got a bit higher, I don't think he's that great, but it's pretty easy to see whether Ranulf has a space on your team or not, based on like what else you have to deploy. Bastian was really fun for me to use. I really enjoyed using Bastian for the little time that I had him. I'm actually not sure if these characters are in the right order. I feel like Largo was first, but whatever, we'll just go through in this order. I thought Bastian was a lot of fun to use. He joined after my Soren died, and so I just kind of decided, you know, we'll give him a go. Just like Calill, he can use the same long range magic things. He can use Thunder. They have the same base magic, I believe it's 19. But when Bastian joins, the benchmarks for one kill are going to be a bit higher. My Bastian couldn't one-shot, so I think if you use Calill often enough, you could get her to one-shot. Bastian almost definitely isn't, unless you have like a Spirit Dust left at this point in the game. Which, I mean, you likely don't if you have been using any other magical character. But the thing about Bastian is he has Corrosion, which I think is I believe it's a skill percent activation. I'm gonna double check this real quick. Corrosion. Basically, every time Bastian attacks something, there's a chance, like a very low chance, but an existent chance that he nukes someone's entire equipped weapon. Apparently it's by user's level plus 20 if promoted, so Bastion is level 13 stage, so that's like 33 durability gone. The main use I found for this is getting rid of enemy long range tomes, which only have 5 uses, so no matter what the enemy the level is, Corrosion will break that weapon. It only procced like twice in the playthrough in a relevant place, but the 2 times it happened, it was absolutely hype. Bastion has 21 skill, so 21% chance for that to happen. Not the greatest way to use your long-range tomes is having a chance of getting rid of something. You wish you could just like use the tome to kill the enemy, and you would need only 1 or 2 uses for it. But enemy sages have quite high res, so that's not likely to happen. It's not like you have a physical weapon that can do it instead most of the time. And these sages are often like behind doors and walls where you can't get them as easily. So this is about as good as it gets. This is the other reason why having a flyer is so good, is you can maybe pick off a sage or a bishop from a lot further away than you should, thanks to like the help of Reyson, for example. The Bastion is like a funny backup option you can do sometimes, and also just like Thunder crits are good sometimes, but again, like I said, I don't think he one-shots a whole lot. So I'll throw him in filler. I really enjoy using him, but I don't think he's that great, and he's definitely not like a main combat unit, but he has like some occasional fun utility every now and then. Lucia, absolute trash, couldn't kill a thing. I think I killed like 1 wyvern with her, and it was like a miracle. She did like 5 damage to him with the silver sword or something. Absolutely awful, wouldn't recommend. But hey, cool hair. Joffrey, really my main go-to example for why he just doesn't, like, Maniac Mode was just not tested correctly with regards to like his bases compared to the enemies. He was just not performing well. Even with the Brave Lance that he, I believe, joins with, he just does like, you'll put him against the Paladins like 5x2 or 10x2 when they have like over 40 HP. It doesn't work very well. It doesn't double. He doesn't one round anything besides maybe Sages. I did get him up to par because with Paragon he grows quite fast, and at that point in the game you definitely have a Night Ward left over to give to him and start like boost his defenses a bit and get some speed growth going. But it was just a little bit of a painful journey, and it was not a fun time to train him up, which is weird because he's supposed to be a pre-promote. They're supposed to be ready for combat when they joined, but he really wasn't. Still a lot of useful risker drops, same thing as with Haar. Sometimes I would Vigor 4 people with Reyson, or I would Vigor 3 people with Reyson. I didn't really find a great use of the 4th slot, so I just move in Chadtrie, Vigor Chadtrie, and use Chadtrie to rescue Reyson back out of enemy range, and my frontline units would take care of the nearby enemies, while everyone else was kind of hid away and hope there would be no reinforcements. He can take like 1 or 2 hits from enemies. He doesn't like instantly die or anything, but you usually don't want him to fight over units that have like high strength, high speed, 1-2 range, crit forges, good weaponry, over some guy with like lances and bows that can like javelin for like 5 damage. It's just a massive difference between like a trained paladin and a Chadtrie at this point in the game. It's just not very good. Largo, I think, is like the same problems for the most part as Chadtrie. He could be turned into something if he had a bunch of bonus experience, but you probably don't. He is more of an offensive powerhouse, of course, if he does get going. He has potentially high strength and speed, and of course high HP. So kind of like a Boyd-like build, but a lot more fragile feeling. I always feel like Largo is about to die, even though he's like millions and millions of HP. He can probably sort of work if you put a lot of work in, but at that point in the game, training him is quite painful. This is where I think that -5 experience that you get for kills on Maniac really starts to hurt. Or, well, it's just another example of it hurting so bad is you need to feed a unit. And because of this, to get a level on a unit, let's say they usually take like 4 kills to get a level up, now they need 5, for example. You really only get like 30 XP per kill, even if you're like slightly on a level like Largo is. Not very good. Also, Berserkers don't get a crit bonus in Japanese version compared to English version. That also is what hurts Zihark and Mia, by the way, if that wasn't obvious, and Stefan. It's just no crit bonus for these kind of classes. It's unfortunate, but it is what it is, and not much you can do about it. Good filler-ish, I guess. I don't think I ever deployed him beyond like the Eat Rock chapter. That's a map where he's kind of okay because he has more movement than something like a Paladin, but I think I would still deploy a trained Paladin over an untrained Largo there, just because one more move doesn't really compensate for insanely much better durability and offense most of the time. Valencia, I mean, staff utility with a flyer was kind of okay, but for my Iron Man, she was a game over condition, so I was like extra scared of using her. I think I might have deployed her for one more chapter, like a potential game over. I deployed her like 3 times, actually. I deployed her for endgame as well, which was very scary. Wouldn't recommend. With most of these characters, it doesn't really matter if they die at some point, because it's like, okay, I can just play on without them. So if they die at the end of a really long chapter, you can decide whether or not you want to continue or not. I think most players would like to reset for their favorite training projects. I didn't have a choice on my Iron Man, but if I did have a choice, I would really hate to deploy Valencia and see her die accidentally. She's very fragile. It's very easy to forget that she like loses speed from the immediate base and gets doubled as a result and dies from that. Weak to bows, weak to ballistas. Very annoying. But the staff utility with like Hammer or Recover or Physic can be quite nice, so sometimes it might be worth if you have the spare deployment slot, but I wouldn't highly recommend it. Late game, Laguz, Nasir, Ena, they're fine, I guess. They're not great. I have a special utility in that in the old tier list, but honestly, this is what I made the AFK tier for, is the dragons, because they're just not around enough to do a whole lot. And when they join, I think they're all meant to be is like people that can kill Ashnard. As I've always said, I think Nasir is the worst one because you have a good Ike that killed the Black Knight if you manage to get Nasir. But it's not about like who's good and who's not. This is just the order that they were in. I don't really care which one of these two is better. They just don't do a whole lot. You'll probably deploy them for like, I think they're force deployed in both. If not, they're probably like among the best deploys because you just might not have enough units to fill the whole roster in the chapter they join in endgame. They're okay, I guess. You can give them resolve if you feel like not giving it to Ike. They're alright. There's just not much to say about them. They're really bulky. They hit kind of hard, but not hard enough to like, I think sometimes like 3-shot enemies for the most part. And they're weak to thunder magic, and they have okay enough res to survive, good enough res to survive most of the time. Gifka ran off again for some reason. Here you go. Come back, Gifka. None of these are around enough. Ashnard, first phase. On Hard and Maniac, Ashnard has 2 phases, and they're not around for the first phase, so they can't help you with the final chapter. And when you get to the second phase, the game is basically over. You're probably capable of taking down the second phase, so you won't need these. I like Gifka in the end game because I had like a weird end game sequence where Ashnard moved towards me, and I had to hold him off for a bunch of turns, so having Gifka around helped a little bit. Pick Gifka for strength transfer if you're going to play Radiant Dawn afterwards, because none of these guys are going to cap anything besides Gifka capping his strength. They're like not very useful overall, but you'll probably use them when you have them because they're basically force deployed. But you don't need me to tell you that. So that's the whole squad in a nutshell. I hope this enlightened you a little bit. You can see there's like a big overlap with what I would recommend for Haar and what I would recommend for Maniac. It's just that the categories are a bit stricter and there are some small changes to units. Like I think Soren and Ilyana work out a lot better thanks to Thunder crit forges. But if they're not crit forges, then they're probably in the same place as they are in Hard. I think Armor Knights are a fair bit better. Brom and Chadtrie especially, but Tauroneo possibly as well. And other than that, the mode doesn't really change unit dynamics all that much. It's just that the good get much better relative to the, well, not bad, but like harder to use units. Like on Hard, if you want to use like a group of these units, like I don't know, pick like 3 to 5 or something, you can get away with it. And if you're willing to like cheese a little bit, do some boss abusing or save a bunch of Bex or stat boosters, usually fine. On Maniac, I might maybe pick like 1 or 2 personally and stick with that. And even that is like a lot. Out of these, I think the only one I really gave a lot of attention to are Chadtrie and Joffrey, Volke, and I mean Bastian, but not really a lot of investment, just a lot of fun. It's really what I did. Oh, and Rolf. I guess I grinded up Rolf. So I used about 4 or 5 when you look at it that way, but not all of them equally. And I definitely felt it was a lot harder to do than it was on Hard. But if that's what makes the game fun for you, then I would still pick some of these if you like that. But definitely incorporate some of these because they're going to make your life a lot easier. Especially a Sage, a Flyer, Tanith, Reyson of course, but you knew that. Definitely nice. Like, look at the benchmarks you need to fight enemy paladins beyond Chapter 18. Try to have someone ready to double those and survive against those on the front lines, and your life will be a lot easier on Maniac. That's all I got for today. Thank you for watching. I don't know how long this turned out, but hopefully it was enough to keep you entertained. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time.